What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Lions Pulse. I am Miko, once again back here to do a live stream. It's been a minute, but most of you guys know where I've been over at Pride of Detroit making videos over there. So it's been a little tough getting back over to the main channel to be able to make videos or to do live streams like that. But I had some time today, wanted to at least get a live stream out because, again, wasn't able to do one yesterday. Was over with Pride Detroit doing the main POD cast with those guys. If you've never checked it out, or if you haven't checked out yesterday's episode, be sure to go check that out over wherever you listen to podcasts, or over on the Twitch channel as well. But with all that said, it's been a minute since I've been here. But I'm pretty sure those of you guys who have watched this channel know the routine at this point. Be sure to hit that like button. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you are new to this channel. And then once you've done those things, be sure to jump into the comment section. Let me know who's hanging out with me tonight. And that way we can have a really dope conversation. Got my first person in here from the Twitch channel, Krolik2, saying, "Hey, Miko, what's good with you, Krolik?" Karen in the chat saying, "Hey." Good to see you, Karen. And yeah, so we're just gonna have a really pretty laid back conversation. Like I said, um, basically wanted to kind of like dive into training camp because the Lions are in basically their last week of training camp, last preseason game of the year, and there's been a lot of I've talked about a lot of things over on Pride of Detroit as far as like observations, big takeaways that have come out of the day, but wanted to do a video here where really just diving into like biggest takeaways that I've had from like all of training camp. And as we kind of switch gears a little bit, getting ready for the regular season, what are the things that have happened throughout training camp and the preseason that have stood out the most to me and that I think are actually going to kind of translate over into the regular season for the Lions and really be some of the deciding factors and things that will help them win games once they matter most. But before we do that, really quick, a few more shout outs. Shout out to my guy Grit in the channel over on YouTube with the blue heart, the lion emoji, and the football emoji. Damian Smith saying, after today, I'm concerned about the degree to which the offense relies on St. Brown. Can they get the passing game going without him? Damian, we're gonna talk about it. It's on my list, so we're gonna definitely talk about it. Krolik asking the question, Brian Branch, defensive player of the year. We're gonna talk about it. We are definitely gonna talk about it. Again, for those of you who have seen me or heard me wax poetically about Brian Branch, it's no secret. Brian Branch is one of my favorite, not just like rookies, but Lions players this year. So without further ado, like I said, the way based off of what the thumbnail says and the title, I want to just talk about what we've learned to this point. And like I said, these are some of the biggest things that have kind of stood out to me. Feel free to jump into the comment section. Let me know from your perspective, what is the biggest thing or what are some of the biggest things that have stood out to you as we've gone throughout training camp. And so I want to dive into the very first one off top. And I think one of the biggest things going into training camp and going into the offseason was that the Lions needed to fix things on defense. And it was more than just like getting talent in my perspective. From my perspective, I also thought they needed somebody to really help lead the charge. And not just from a statistical standpoint and not just from a performance standpoint, but it was like, who's going to be that voice in the locker room? Who's going to be the person that rallies the group together and really gets them marching and playing to a certain standard? And going into training camp or going through training camp, I feel like the Lions have that guy, and that guy being CJ Gardner-Johnson for me. CJ has come into this Lions organization, has come into this defense, and simply by being a presence throughout camp and by being this vocal presence has in my mind transformed the entire mentality of the defense to date as of right now, in just how they go about practicing, how they go about having this swagger about them. And when I see that, it's something that's intangible as far as leadership and being vocal and things like that. It doesn't necessarily translate over to wins per se. There's no way of you saying like, hey, having a good leader is going to lead to this many wins. But one of the things that always kind of like rubbed me the wrong way about the defense, and I don't want to say rubbed me the wrong way, but just something that I realized is like, hey, this is missing from this defensive unit, was that when they even talked about, talk to some of the guys last year, talking to like an Alex Anzalone, talking to, an Aiden Hutchinson, or talking to, a Tracy Walker or a couple of different players, one of the things that was kind of always resounding amongst those players whenever the idea of like, hey, who's the leader of the group and how do you lead and things of that nature, most of those guys had the same story, which is like, hey, I lead by example. Hey, I just try to be the hardest worker in the room, so on and so forth. CJ doesn't operate that way, and it's kind of been that way from the time that he's, landed in Detroit from his very first press conference where he kind of put it out there like, "Hey, I want to lead guys. I've done a lot of good things in this league, and the next thing that I believe that I am capable of doing and that I have yet to do is lead well." And so, in a league where press conferences definitely get hyped up and, it's easy to find sound bites here and there, that was something that stood out to me, and the fact that it wasn't just something that he said, but since, the Lions have really hit the field, even back in OTAs, CJ's been about that action. He has definitely backed up the message that he was putting out or like early on in off-season workouts. And so now we get to training camp and he suffers an injury and he's missing for a few days, but the work that he had kind of laid out in OTAs and, team workouts and mini camp, you started hearing talk about like, yes, CJ went down. It was a scary moment. We weren't really sure how that was going to impact the rest of the Lions, off season, because at that time we didn't know the severity of the injury. But from that point on, CJ went down. And then I remember like one of the big observations that came out of that day was like Tracy Walker came in and he was that guy. And all of a sudden he's more vocal. And now that entire unit, that entire secondary is communicating more and they're seem to be more on the same page with one another. And that to me, like I said, it's hard to just, give like a certain win total to like, hey, this is how important having a leader is. But it's one of those things that I do. I take a step back and I look at it and I'm just like, yo, these guys know now what a standard is. And CJ is that guy where not only does he talk the talk, but then he goes out here, once he's healthy, gets out there in practice the first time they get on pads, and he's the guy that's delivering hits. He's the guy that's doing the talking. He's the guy that's always bringing the energy, it seems, to this defense. And I can't help but feel like, you know what, when these guys hit the regular season, I don't know. Like I said, I can't say for sure, like, hey, they're going to be a top 10 defense, they're going to be a top 15. But I can tell you this for sure, at least how I feel right now, they will not be a bottom 25 defense. I truly believe, based off of the energy that he's been bringing and the observations that we've been getting, or the little bit of information we've been getting out of training camp about how players like Hutchinson look, drastically better than they did compared to last year. Seeing John Kaminsky in these preseason games and seeing how drastically improved he looks, there's enough there across the board for me to feel like, you know what, this defense is going to be improved. And having a guy like Chauncey Gardner Johnson on the back end or as just a part of that defense to help lead it gives me a lot of hope that, you know what, going forward, this defense is in good hands. Aaron Glenn has a guy that he can count on, and he has players all around him that he can kind of just roll out and execute the game plan that he has in place. So that's one of the first big things that I've learned and kind of taken from, training camp early on, so far throughout, into the off season. Really quick, jumping into the chat real quick, Grit saying I'm very concerned with O-line depth. Yeah, that's something that I don't think going into camp I had on my radar. And it's not so much that it wasn't possibly a concern even then. It's just I think we're so hyped up on the fact that like, hey, the offense was good last year. It was so much better than the defense was last year. It was a top 5 offense and this, that, and the third, that I don't think anybody even thought for a second about O-line depth or even wide receiver depth or things of that nature. It was just like, no, the offense is going to work. We have Ben Johnson, Jared Goff is back. You still have Amon-Ra St. Brown. You had most of the same pieces. And I think a lot of people were just like, no, we'll hit the ground running. And I think this past game against the Jaguars was really like that punch in the gut to kind of remind you that like, hey, this team still needs depth at certain places. And that if you have too many injuries along the offensive line, that could really be a problem for you. We talked about this yesterday on the Pride of Detroit channel, and about the idea of like how concerned are you about the offensive line? And I'm concerned, but like I'm not as concerned as some people are. And it's mainly because unless you start having like mass injuries across your offensive line, you need to be concerned in general. If you're having that many injuries across the offensive line, you need to be concerned. But could the Lions afford to have like maybe one guy go down here or there and still have viable backups? Yeah, I think so. You still have whoever wins between Graham and Vitae is a flexible piece that can move like across the offensive line, playing both interior and at least with Vitae, can at least play on the outside playing right tackle if called upon. Graham can play any of the three interior spots. And I've at least been somewhat impressed with Jermaine Ifedi. So I feel confident enough that if, again, if Decker had to miss a couple games, if Sewell had to miss a couple games, you have a guy that can play either left or right and man that position for a few games. So kind of like how Karen's saying it, over on Twitch, like I'm a 5 out of 10 concerned when it comes to the offensive line, and I think that's probably where I'm at as well. And it's also something else we talked about is like, yo, in the NFL, there's not many teams that have O line depth. So yes, it's a concern, but I think it only becomes a serious concern if you're having mass injuries across the board. Um, Shout out to my guy Darth Twerk in the chat saying, "What up, Miko? What up, chat?" Um, Twerk also saying, especially it seems we don't have a third offensive tackle. And like I said, I think Ifedi is that third tackle for me. Um, they've played him at both left and right, and I think he looked great at right, and I think he looked pretty good at left. Um, Matt Nelson isn't the answer. I think we can all kind of just agree on that from the jump. Is like it's not Matt Nelson, and so for me, I think it's Ifedi like pretty easily at this point. Um, Joe Lewis 313 saying, I think we're making a mistake not getting our offensive starters in rhythm by sitting them the whole preseason. That was something like, listen, again, another thing that we talked about on yesterday's stream, and I will say this: would I like to see the starters get out there and play a series or two? For my own peace of mind, yeah. For my own peace of mind, I think it would make me feel better just to see them go out there and see what the offense looks like. But at the same time, does it really matter? Like, if the Lions go out there, for example, and they went out there for an offensive drive and they went 3 and out on their first drive, are you now screaming doom and gloom? Like, and that's the only series they get. Are you going to scream about that being doom and gloom, or are you going to be like, well, I just didn't see enough? And so at the end of the day, like, we'll see what the offense is come week one. But I definitely hear you in the sense of like, I would like to see it, but at the same time, I don't think it's a must. And especially when they have a practice like today where they basically ran a full game basically and kept score, did tackling, taking people to the ground, all that type of stuff. And I guess if there's some concern to be had, the defense looked better on today's, mock game or scrimmage or however you want to look at it. The defense looked drastically better than the offense. So does that mean that there's some concern? Maybe, but I think that concern kind of goes back uh to what Damien was saying earlier, and it's another thing that I've kind of noticed as far as like, learning and watching from, training camp is that Amon-Ra St. Brown needs a big year. Like Jared Goff sent the text to Ben Johnson saying like, "Hey, St. Brown big year," as if like that's like it's a nice to have, but it's based off the way this offense has progressed throughout training camp. I almost feel like Amon-Ra St. Brown needs to have a big year for this offense to have the success that we want it to have. Because outside of Amon-Ra, it's maybe been Khalif here or there. It was Sam Laporta early in training camp. He's obviously, found some success with Gibbs and Montgomery here and there. But when you start looking at like, hey, who else is making like consistent plays on the outside? It's a very short list. It's a very short list of wide receivers that are finding success for the Lions. And at the top of that list is Amon-Ra St. Brown, which isn't a problem. He's your number one wide receiver. Your number one wide receiver should be dominating and should be unguardable if they're, of that ilk, if they're that talented. But the problem that you start developing is that, like, okay, well, but where's Josh Reynolds? And where's Marvin Jones? Obviously, JMO's been dealing with injuries. You start kind of really quickly start questioning, like, okay, but where is the rest of the production going to come from? And it quickly gets to a point with me where it's like, well, if Amon Ra is not producing, I have a hard time wondering, like, yo, how successful can this offense be without the threat of other wide receivers? You look across the league and some of the best passing offenses, like, yes, they have a dominant one, but they also have a couple like capable twos and threes that can also contribute. And so that's an issue that I think the Lions have. And it's something that like I didn't really consider going into training camp. I just figured again, top five offense, they found ways of making it work. And I think outside of Amon Ra having a big year, I think a lot more eyes are going to be on Khalif because Khalif the last 2 years has been second leading receiver on the team. And I think you're going to see Khalif get way more opportunities, not just because JMO's out, but because he's a guy that like wins matchups and he's actually able, to get open and make plays down the field. Um, so that's kind of where I stand. Excuse me. With the offense and Amon Ra specifically is I think he is going to have a big year, but not just because like he's gotten that much better. I think he's going to need that level of production just for this offense to find the success that they need um, going forward. Shout out to my guy Perry Ball saying, "Hey Miko, um, Perry, I've been good, man. Thanks for asking. Staying busy, making videos, doing what I enjoy doing. So it's been fun to be able to get on here and talk Lions." Perry saying my biggest concern is the O line and the O line backup. Yeah, and again, Perry, we just talked about that, and I think after the way the offensive line looked against Jacksonville, I think it's a concern for a lot of people. A lot of people are going to look at that performance and say, "Hey, are we solid enough if we take injuries?" And I think we are. Again, as long as you're not suffering multiple injuries at that spot, or along that group, I think you're fine. I think you can afford for, obviously we know Frank has the toe injury. And if Frank ends up missing a game, you have Graham and Graham can slide in, at the center spot and play there for a few games while Frank gets a little bit of rest. If something else happens, if Vitae needs to go up, if Vitae goes down, Graham can step up. Um, and then I think Colby Sorsdal is going to make this roster, and I think he will get better throughout the season as he's able to continue to work with the likes of Frank Ragnow, Jonah Jackson, and Vitae and Graham as well. I think he will just continue to get better in that regard. And then, like I said, I think Ifedi's a solid, tackle three for this team. Um, Karen saying Andrew Whitworth said he'd like to get some preseason game reps to get nerves/mistakes out. And I agree. Like I think Dan Campbell talked about it this today in his press conference. Somebody asked him like, "Hey, what is it that you're missing um from just like having the starters out there?" And he kind of talked about that type of thing. Like you don't really get like the actual feel of the game because it is practice. And so like as much as they try to simulate that effect and that feel, sometimes you don't get that. Um and I think that is a concern, but at the same time, you're also hoping that like, hey, your veteran quarterback can navigate those things. Um, yeah, there's some things that the rookies might have to go through, but I mean, that's why you have, David Montgomery. That's why you have Brock Wright to kind of alleviate those guys so there's not a ton of pressure and they'll be splitting snaps with veterans who understand like the momentum of putting a drive together and things of that nature. Um, but I think at the end of the day, I think we'll feel better for it. I think if the Lions go out and lose to the Chiefs week 1, I don't think anyone's gonna say, well, this is because they didn't play any preseason games, right? I think we'll look at that and you'll be able to see much more tangible things that are the reason why the Lions aren't playing as well as they should be at that point in the season. Damian saying St. Brown also draws defensive attention that way the way no other receiver does. Yeah, that's also true too. So I think that's like having Saint once he's healthy from his ankle injury is going to open up a lot of things for this offense. And even if he's getting a lot of the attention, I mean, just by the nature of like where he plays and where he lines up, it's going to be tough for teams to double him in the slot if he lines up in the slot. And even still, the addition of, I guess, like the counter thing, right? To like, hey, there's not a lot of wide receivers producing throughout camp, is that you do have a tight end that is, great as far as getting separation and running after the catch. You have two really talented running backs in both Demo and Gibbs. Um, you have a Khalif Raymond, and once JMO's healthy, you'll have, a speedster that you can count on. It's just a matter of, again, what is going to help this team find success. And I think the thing that will help them is if the passing game is struggling, if other receivers are struggling to get open, if other receivers are struggling to make catches, the beauty of this offense and the way it's constructed is that it's built off the run game anyway. So the run game being successful is going to be the thing that also opens up a lot of things in the passing game. So outside of Amon Ra being a decoy on in the passing game, once you have a viable run game and you're able to run the play action type of plays that they like to run, it's going to make your passing attack even more effective going forward. Also, David, I see your message in the chat. I do have a public email. Hit me up over on Twitter and we can talk about it. Because I'm assuming there's something that you want to talk about. So yeah, hit me up on Twitter and we can definitely chop it up over there. Public Enemy saying, "What's up, Miko? My question is, do you think the loss of DJ Chark is more of a concern than we thought at the time?" I think so. Again, we were just talking about, how I think Amon-Ra needs to have a big year because I don't know outside of Khalif, which Khalif is like sneaky good for this Lions passing attack. I don't know who else has been producing, or I haven't heard of too many other people producing that we know are going to get snaps. We've heard about Dylan Drummond, and Dylan Drummond might make this roster. I don't know how many snaps Dylan Drummond is actually going to get, though, once he makes this roster. Chase Cota has looked good in small doses. I can't tell you how many snaps Chase Cota is actually going to get, though. And so that's where things become kind of murky at the wide receiver spot. And if you still had DJ Chark, you would at least know, okay, you have a guy on the outside that can absolutely win as a deep threat and at least showed it, when he was healthy at times with the Lions last year. I don't think it was a mistake in not re-signing him because clearly DJ had a number in mind and he wanted something specific. But yeah, I think the Lions could potentially miss him. It wouldn't shock me if, during those first couple weeks without JMO, if things kind of look a little sketchy in the passing game. But we'll I think that's why I said like the Lions have a running attack, and that's I think the thing that they're going to lean on more than anything. Rushing attack, play action, and then obviously Amon-Ra St. Brown being a mismatch in the passing game. Derek saying, plus I think Marvin Jones is going to really help in those first 6 weeks without JMO. And that's also very true. I do think there's going to be some growing pains with Marvin. And not because like Marvin's lost a step, not because of anything on Marvin's end, except for the fact that I think his play style is not necessarily friendly with Jared Goff's play style. Jared Goff has typically seemed to work best with wide receivers that can run crisp routes, get separation, and win in that way as far as in the passing game. Whereas Marvin Jones has been the type of guy who excels and works best as a jump ball contested catch kind of guy. So I think Marvin will help. I think he will definitely be someone that is going to build some chemistry with Jared Goff, but I do think it's going to take a little bit more time for Jared to probably even feel comfortable throwing those types of passes to Marvin. When even though Marvin may look covered, he's the type of athlete that can still get up there and win those those 50-50 balls in those types of situations. Shout out to my guy Dan Pask in the chat saying Chase Cota has the size but not DJ speed. Yeah, I think that is a fair evaluation. Chase, that's one of the things that I do like about Chase. You can tell he has the size, he knows how to use his size. It just becomes a matter of like, does he do enough things? Because like I said, outside of the Giants game, he had a really good like coming out party against the Giants. Obviously, he has the touchdown pass against the Jaguars. The only problem that I have with Chase, and the only reason I'm not on the same bandwagon as some people are with Chase Cota, is that he had 2 catches for 9 receptions. And that's not his fault. Obviously, we know about the offensive line struggles, but it's hard for me to get, super excited about a player that's not getting a ton of opportunities. So I think like Chase having a good game, a really good game against the Panthers could be the thing that helps separate him, could be the thing that helps him get a roster spot going forward. Um, Joe Lou saying, I agree, but my concern is golf underthrowing our wide receivers like last year. And I think it's just it's I think that comes more so with chemistry, right? I think we know that golf can make those throws. It just becomes a matter of it's not as automatic, right? As in comparison to other quarterbacks. There's other quarterbacks that can throw the deep ball better. Jared can make the deep throws. It's just you just don't know if he's going to overthrow, if he's going to underthrow. There's been times in camp where he's overthrown JMO, he's overthrown Khalif. So he's capable of overthrowing people too. It just becomes a matter of getting on the same page with your receivers as well. And Karen has so asking the question, has JG thrown him many contested balls at camp? From what I've heard, he's Marvin's gotten a couple here and there, right? It's and I think in the way that golf probably looks at it and probably is progressing through, his practices and going through his progressions, it's like it's almost like throwing to Marvin as like a last ditch effort. And I think that's different than like again, if Marvin's the first read, trusting him to win those battles and winning that separation easy. And so, if excuse me, if Marvin can win that separation and if he can make himself a viable target for JG, then I think he makes it a little bit easy for himself to kind of get those opportunities. Um, Damien asking, does Jason Moore Jr. have a chance or is he just a 1 week camp body? So if you go by what Dan Campbell said this morning, everybody still has an opportunity, right? That's what they're saying, that everybody still has an opportunity. I think the way to look at it is that Jason Moore Jr. has the longest shot, right? Because he's not going to have a body of work. And so, short of him going out here against the Panthers and maybe putting up a ridiculous performance and him being, drastically better than any of the other wide receivers that have been on this roster, yeah, it's a bit of a toss up. I don't think it's very likely, but again, I think the that wide receiver 5, wide receiver 6 battle spot is going to go down to the wire at this point. I think Dylan Drummond could easily get that spot with a good performance against the Panthers. I could say the same thing about Chase Cota. And then I could also say the same thing about Antoine Green. Antoine Green he didn't have 60 yards like Chase Cota. He hasn't had a touchdown. But what he's been asked to do in the passing game, they've been using him on screens and in the short passing game. He's been getting open and he's been making those catches as well. And so that's a huge sign for Antoine Green, who came into this draft class as as a deep threat. That was kind of what he excelled at. And so for him to also be showing that like, hey, I can operate in the short to mid range passing game as well, could be something that's really beneficial and that could help him get a spot as well as what he's doing on special teams. So those are all really good things that could really help him going forward. Um, all right, before I get too stuck on the wide receiver talk, let me get back to another thing that we learned, and this is going to be obviously like the most fun thing for me to talk about. It's that Brian Branch's progression throughout camp has been the most enjoyable thing I have ever seen. Uh, I don't know. I wasn't doing YouTube at the moment, like as far as like going through the draft process, but I'll give you guys a little bit of backstory. Um, I think it was Colton Pouncey, the Lions beat writer for The Athletic, had posted like a highlight reel of Brian Branch over on Twitter. And I saw it, went and watched like so much Brian Branch tape. Actually, that's not true. I had watched Brian Branch in the college football playoff. And I think it's when they were playing Kansas State, and he was everywhere. He was hitting everyone and everything that moved. And then Colton posted that highlight reel maybe a couple months later. I went, binged watched so many highlights on Brian Branch. And I was at the point where I was like, I would take Brian Branch at 6. That's how high I was on Brian Branch at the time, is that I would take him at 6. And when the Lions didn't take him, I wasn't mad, but I was just like, yo, like if they would have taken him, Some people would have been like, how do you take a safety or a nickel that high? I'd have been thrilled. And so when they were able to get him in the second round, nothing else Brad Holmes did in that draft mattered to me. He could have traded away every other pick, and I still would have felt like they came out on top because I just thought Brian Branch was that good. Fast forward to what he's been doing in training camp, and I don't have words for it at this point. I'm finding it difficult to find adjectives to describe Brian Branch at this point because it doesn't matter the day, it doesn't matter the opponent, it doesn't matter where he is on the field. Brian Branch is going to make a play. He's going to get a pass breakup. He's going to tackle well. He's going to get a sack. He's going to get an interception. He just finds ways to make plays. And it's early. And obviously, we have to wait to see like all these other rookies get on the field. And he plays a position that's going to be very difficult for him to probably put up the numbers he needs to win Defensive Rookie of the Year. But starting now, he needs to be like when they started listing off their early favorites, Brian Branch needs to be very high up on that list. I know it's going to be Will Anderson. I know it's going to be Jalen Carter. I know it's going to be the guys that are more likely to get sacks and more likely to um, make plays as far as like getting sacks or stopping the run and things like that. But what Brian Branch is probably going to bring to this defense is going to be crazy. I just feel it in my bones is that if he can stay healthy, he is going to find very unique ways to make his presence felt all across the field. Um and so yeah, like I don't know how else I've given up on trying to slow down like my excitement. I've given up on trying to slow down the hype train on Ryan Branch. He's just that guy. And I'm at the point where I just want to see him play. I was so disappointed that he didn't get to play against the Jaguars, even though it's a sign that, like, hey, they view him, he's that important to their defense where they're like, yeah, we can't even play a nickel corner because he's that important to our defense. We don't want to risk injuring him. And so I can't wait to see him play against Kansas City. And I know it's probably going to be like he's going to have his ups and downs in that game because he's going to have to cover Travis Kelsey, and that's going to be a tough responsibility for him. But hopefully they give him some breaks with him and CJ possibly being able to switch off and things of that nature. But I went into camp thinking that Jack Campbell would kind of steal the show, especially once Pads came on. And Jack by no means has been disappointing. He has been really good in camp. He was really good against the Jaguars. I came away very impressed with him in that game. But Brian Branch has already, I think, in my mind, proven that he should have been a first round pick. There's no reason that he should have fell to the second round. And the fact that a slow 40 time has possibly gifted the Lions one of the best players in this draft is just crazy to me. Um, Derek saying, "How can you not love BB?" Just seems like he gets it, and that's the thing. I think that's the thing with a lot of these rookies. When you're talking about Brian Branch, whether you're talking about Sam Laporta, whether you're talking about Jahmyr Gibbs, whether you're talking about Jack Campbell, these guys look like they get it. They don't look like the moment is too big. It's again, if I can wax poetically about Jack Campbell for a second, that's the thing that I enjoy the most about watching Jack Campbell when he's been in on these preseason games is that he does not look shaken. He doesn't look like he's lost. He doesn't look like he doesn't know where he's supposed to be. And at linebacker, that is a position that's easy to see that. We've seen it with Derek Barnes. We've seen it with Malcolm Rodriguez at times. We've seen it with Jelani Tavai, or just pick a linebacker. We've seen that player not look like they know where they're supposed to be and then end up missing a play or missing a tackle or being too quick on the trigger and firing at the wrong hole. Jack is patient. He understands where he's supposed to be. He reads blocks well, and he's a finisher. He gets to where he's supposed to be. He makes the tackle, and he limits the amount of gain that opposing running backs have. Um, let me see what else we got here in the chat. Um, Dan Pass saying, I think the Lions picking Laporta first showed their priority, but we got hella lucky that his RAS score his RAS scare teams off. Yeah, as far as talking about Branch's RAS score, yeah, because again, he didn't have the speed, right? He didn't necessarily have the measurables for a safety or a nickel or whatever you're going to play, and that's fine. But the Lions knew what they had in him, and I think that's one of those things that you have to just trust your scouting. Like, we got to keep in mind, this was a guy who started for Nick Saban's defense as a freshman, and that just doesn't happen at Alabama. Let alone, it doesn't happen at many like Power Five conferences in the US as far as college football is concerned. It's very rare. You have to be a very special breed of player to come into, a school of that caliber and start as a freshman. And Brian Branch just kind of show that he has it. Um, David saying uh Branch take of that draft day of the draft, Dan? Man, steal. There we go. Man, that messed me up too, Dave. Branch the steal of the draft. Steak is a great typo though. Yeah, I agree, Dan. That is a really good typo. Um, whoops. Public Enemy saying Brad Holmes drafts players with instincts and traits instead of just traits. Very smart. And I do. I think that's the thing that makes Brad such a great GM. I get that, like, listen, there's going to be players that are going to have really good years. I'm sure you've all heard things about Jalen Carter like I have, and it's going to make some people angry, right? Hearing that Jalen Carter is doing really well and things of that nature. And that's listen, I understand it. I get it. There's players that were drafted that I was very high on that the Lions either didn't get a chance to draft or chose not to draft. And that's perfectly fine, right? Dorian Thompson Robinson, the quarterback that's currently doing really well in Cleveland, was a quarterback that I was high on. That I was like, hey, if they don't want to draft Hendon Hooker, that was another quarterback I was really high on. The Lions went in a different direction. They still drafted Hendon Hooker. I did my research. I studied Hendon Hooker, and all of a sudden, I was in love with Hendon Hooker. The same thing is going to be true with this draft. There's going to be players all throughout it, but I think understanding that Brad Holmes does his research, and I think this draft class more than probably any other one, it's really showing off. It's really showing off in the forms of Jahmyr Gibbs. It's showing up in the regards of Sam Laporta and Jack Campbell and Brian Branch and Broderick Martin, who a lot of us didn't know, but is still getting consistent reps with the second team. And sure, he's making his mistakes and things of that nature, but he's also showing himself capable of being that rotational guy and deserving of those reps. So I'm I couldn't be happier with the job that Brad Holmes has done to this point with this roster and with this draft class. Derek saying we've seen way too many rookies over the years that you can tell from rep one they were just not going to work out. So nice to see the front office identifying the right guys for once. And that's the biggest thing. And that's the most fun part about watching these rookies is that typically you have to temper expectations. You have to like, okay, we got to wait. They're going to develop. It's probably going to take a year or two. That being the case, or oftentimes being the case. But that doesn't seem be the case with this draft class. Obviously, last draft class when you had Aiden and you had Pascal, like Pascal's dealing with an injury. You had Jamo's dealing with an injury. So yeah, you've had to wait on some guys because of injuries. But as far as just getting on the field and making plays, this draft class seems to be doing that in spades as far as again throughout training camp to this point. Um, so yeah, that's another thing that's been really reassuring. Um, and David bringing up Tease Tabor, yeah, Tease was one of those guys that like, yo, it didn't take long to kind of see like, hey, there was a reason that a lot of teams weren't drafting him. Um, and that there was that hey, maybe clearly Bob Quinn didn't do all of his research. Again, Jelani Tavai was another one where I don't even necessarily believe that Jelani Tavai wasn't a good linebacker. He just wasn't a good fit for this defense, and he definitely shouldn't have been drafted as high as he was. And so that's kind of the situation that you find yourself in when you overdraft players. There's one thing like it's funny how that looks differently between these two GMs, right? Uh, Bob Quinn drafts Jelani Tavai. No one had really heard of Jelani. They were like, hey, people had fourth, fifth round grades on him, and Bob Quinn takes him in the second round. Jelani doesn't pan out. Something similar with Broderick Martin. No one's really heard of him. People had him going much later, sixth, seventh round. He gets drafted in the third, and he's already repping with the twos and showing himself capable of like, hey, he can be a rotational guy. It just goes to show you how drastically scouting is done, and those who do it correctly, you can find hidden gems. And if you find a hidden gem, why wait on it just because other experts told you that you have to? If you feel the conviction and you feel confident in that player, go out and get them. I feel like it's kind of that simple. Um, but in that space, and I'm probably listen. I know we haven't talked in a while. There's been a number of topics that we haven't been able to address, but um, hopefully you guys are going to be nice to me on this one. But it's a tough reality. But in terms of going through training camp and learning new things, one of the things that I learned, and it's been a tough lesson to learn, is that James Houston still has room to grow. I think a lot of us went into training camp, we went into these off-season workouts, and we knew, okay, Aiden, former first round pick, has to make a big leap. He's obviously going to get a lot of snaps at the defensive end position. But then James Houston being this, again, this other hidden gem that Brad Holmes had found, a lot of us went into training camp thinking like, hey, this guy is going to get an opportunity to start. He should be the guy starting opposite Hutch, and those two as a tandem will terrorize defenses, so on and so forth. And then throughout camp, it's been Charles Harris, it's been John Kaminsky, it's been Josh Pascal. Like those are your top guys. Those are the guys that are going from first team to second team. Kaminsky goes up to first team fairly often. Charles Harris is the guy that's been starting opposite Hutch throughout camp. And then Pascal was a guy that is starting, he's locked in on the second team, and then at the same time getting plenty of reps at the same with the first team as well. But then you look at James Houston, and he's at the bottom. He's not at the bottom, but he's battling it out with the Aquaras, and he's getting opportunities with the second team here, but also he's playing a good amount with the third team as well. And I think that was a tough reality for not just me, but for a lot of fans too. And a lot of people have not been. It doesn't make a lot of people feel great, right? Because we all know, we've all seen what James Houston is capable of doing as far as rushing the passer. But I think if we all take a step back and not just focus on the pass rushing aspect of it and realize there's two other downs you have to play before you can get to third down. So before James Houston can even get to an opportunity to rush the passer, he has to show himself capable of playing first and second down. And we just talked about, and most of us kind of agreed in this chat, like, hey, the Lions are elevating these rookies that are performing well. And so if they're not afraid to elevate a second round pick in Brian Branch, if they're not afraid to elevate a pick in Sam Laporta or Jahmyr Gibbs and things like that, and give these guys opportunities to start, if James Houston isn't getting those opportunities as frequently as most of us probably think he should be, that should be, in my mind, a telltale sign that, like, you know what, he's not quite where they need him to be. I think we sometimes forget that when seasons end, these players meet with the coaching staffs. The coaching staff tells them, like, hey, this is what we want you to work on. This is how we think you can get better. Go into the offseason and work on these things so that when you come back into camp next year, you can battle for a better spot. You can battle for whether it's a starting spot, be a higher rotation guy or things of that nature. And I'm not saying that James didn't try to get better. It's just they haven't seen him make the progress that I think they want him to make and that they need him to make him a high volume rotation guy. And I think the next thing that I think a lot of us overlooked and didn't really recognize is how much injuries played into James Houston getting on the field. And obviously once he got on the field, he proved himself and again has done enough to make you think like, hey, he should be on the field. But Charles Harris was a guy that they trusted and they were leaning on heavily. I think I had a video on this channel earlier early in training camp where it kind of broke down like Charles Harris played a lot of snaps for this defense before he got injured. And once he got injured, yes, obviously other guys got opportunities. Josh Pascal played a ton of snaps once he was healthy. John Kaminsky has played a ton of snaps. And so you start looking at these guys that the Lions also like and these guys that the Lions also trust to make plays at the defensive end position. It almost becomes a thing of like, well, you can kind of see what they all have in common. They can all rush the passer, maybe not as well as James, right? James, in my opinion, is still the most naturally gifted and talented pass rusher they have. But they feel confident. They're like, yo, no, these other three guys, Kaminsky, Pascal, Harris, they can all rush the passer at a really good clip. And you put them opposite Hutch, they'll probably be even better pass rushers. But the thing that they all three do much better than James Houston is they defend the run better. And so it's an area where Houston has to improve. I don't think it means that he won't make the roster because I think that's the first place people want to jump is, well, if James Houston has to battle it out, or if James Houston has to be in a camp battle, that means he's probably not going to make the roster. And I don't think that's the same thing. I think James Houston can be in a camp battle and still be a front runner to get on the roster when talking about, getting in ahead of the acquirers, both Julian and Romeo. You know, Romeo's still coming off that Achilles injury. I thought it was really interesting that in Jeremy's podcast where he was kind of recapping practice today, he kind of mentioned like, hey, Romeo doesn't look as athletic as he used to. And you have to kind of think it's a combination of age and that Achilles injury. And that's something that James doesn't have to worry about. He's younger. He still has a lot of his athleticism, that he hasn't tapped into. That could easily put him above the likes of a Romeo. And we know that between him and Julian, the biggest thing that's a knock against Julian is like, hey, he's not consistent. And so in that regard, James Houston is a consistent pass rusher. You know what you're going to get out of him when you put him in on third down. Julian's not quite that. And so in that regard, like, yeah, he's ahead of those guys, but that doesn't mean that he's not in a camp battle. And so that was something that, like, again, it was a bit surprising going through camp and realizing, like, man, James Houston is never quite climbing up the depth chart, really. But then you kind of have to take inventory and you have to take notice of all the other players that are ahead of him that are now healthy and that do a multitude of things for this defense outside of just rush the passer. So I'll take a minute to catch my breath from that long monologue that I had about him. Um, and let's see what else we got here in the chat. You guys have been going back and forth in here. It's awesome to see you guys kind of just, chatting it up in here. Public Enemy saying Brad Holmes passed on Micah Parsons for Sewell, passed on Jordan Davison for Jamison Williams. He passed on Jalen Carter for Gibbs. Was those decisions a bigger mistake than spoken about? I don't think so, because you look at, specifically with Sewell, right? Like the Lions needed a tackle. And I think Panay has kind of proven himself over the years that, like, hey, he's going to be one of those top tier tackles in the NFL. Taking Jordan Davis over JMO, it's kind of tough to say, right? Jordan Davis didn't light the world on fire last year, but he was at least on the field, and Jameson hasn't been able to do that. So if you're out on JMO, if you're upset about, where JMO is at this point in his career and you're comparing it to other players, I can see how you could say, like, hey, was that a mistake? I still say it's too early to tell, because if JMO comes back from his suspension, he's healthy, and he starts tearing up the league, no one's going to care that he missed, the majority of last season and missed 6 games this year. They're just going to be like, oh, this guy is finally living up to the expectation. Passing on Jalen Carter for Gibbs, I said it back when, it started to feel like a possibility. If Brad Holmes passed on Jalen Carter, that to me communicated that the character concerns were too real. It was that simple, right? Because there at least was like proof in the pudding that like Jalen Carter might have some character issues, like actual character issues, and not the stuff that people kind of make up about JMO. And so if that's the case, I'm not going to complain about you not taking a player When you don't feel like he's going to fit your locker room, if you feel like you're going to have to keep an eye on him 24/7, so on and so forth. If that's the concern that you have, if you have that concern as a GM, at the end of the day, like Brad Holmes' job is to not just find good football players, but find players that are actually going to be available and actually, not just be available, but like not going to cause additional headache and problems for the franchise. And if he made that decision on Jalen Carter and decided to go with Jameer Gibbs instead, I can't knock it. You can definitely tell from Jameer's personality, he's a different kind of cat. He seems very low key. He seems very to himself. He doesn't seem like the type of player that's going to have issues or be in trouble a lot. So I can see why, again, they kind of made that decision there. Um, Darth Twerk saying, I always thought of Houston as a pass rush specialist. I think Deion Sanders said it as much when he was coming out. I don't think he's in any danger of being cut though. And I agree. Like I don't think and I think some people get upset when you say that about James Houston. It's like, hey, he's a pass rush specialist. Listen, James Houston will have a long just he will have a long, healthy career just by rushing the passer. He will get paid a lot of money just by rushing the passer. If he's a guy that can continuously go out there and get 8 sacks, 8+ sacks a year, teams are going to be willing to pay him because at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with being a specialist in the NFL. Um, Public Enemy asking the question, would the Lions be better with any of those players? Possibly, right? I think, yeah, if you told me that the Lions were going to have Jordan Davis, Micah Parsons, and Jalen Carter on their defense, yeah, you would have a very star-studded defense. Absolutely. There's no way I'm gonna like say that it's not the case. But how good would your offense be? Right? How good would your offensive line be? Could you have found a right tackle as good as Penei Sewell in the second, third, fourth round? Who knows, right? But you went out and you found an Ali McNeil, you found a Josh Pascal. You again, obviously, yes, back injuries and things of that nature have kind of limited Levi, but you went out and you got a Levi Onwuzurike, you got a Broderick Martin, and so could any of those guys have the careers that maybe Jalen Carter will, or are they going to? Is Josh Pascal going to be the type of pass rusher that Micah Parsons is? No, probably not. But do you need them to be that if you have a cohesive defense, front to back, that you can trust to go out there and make plays and win you football games? I think at the end of the day, that's what matters more so than the individual players that the Lions could have got. Um, um, Grid saying they didn't pass on Carter for Gibbs. Jalen Carter was never a possibility. I think again, once the character stuff kind of came out, then yeah. I think if Jalen Carter, you will never convince me that if Jalen Carter didn't have the character concerns, that he wouldn't have been in play for the Lions. I'll say that much. The character concerns are to me what took Jalen Carter out of the conversation. And if Jalen Carter had been a squeaky clean prospect, then the only conversation we would have been having about him is whether or not he goes top 3, because he probably would have. And so that's kind of where I kind of stand on that whole situation. Um, but I don't know, guys. That was kind of like all like, oh, I did have one more thing. Um, that has kind of stood out to me. And we've kind of talked about it like in a roundabout way. Um, but the way I kind of worded it is that one other thing that I've learned about the Lions going through training camp is that to me the Lions offense is a mystery. I genuinely do not know exactly what it's going to be. Like I know that I think it's going to be a good offense. I don't know if it's going to be top 5 as like it was last year. And part of that is because obviously we haven't seen the starters. The other part of that is because some of the stuff that we talked about earlier, where outside of Amon Ra that I know I can count on, everything else starts to feel like there's a question mark. Even with David Montgomery and Jameer Gibbs, I think they will be very good. I still don't know if they'll be, as good or as effective as Jamal and Swift were just because we saw it. We were able to understand and see how those two players were able to complement each other. Um, but then you kind of look at the rest of the offense, and like I said, there's a lot of Jameer and Sam Laporta are two rookies that you're counting on, and we all know like how difficult it can be with rookie tight ends. And so there's a question mark. So it's not so much me thinking that like, hey, the Lions offense won't be good. Like I said, it's just a question mark and it's a mystery of just being like, we've only seen the second team offense and what the second team offense has done. I could see the starters doing, but at the same time, we know this offense is going to look drastically different when you have one of the better offensive lines up front, when you have a David Montgomery in the backfield, and when Jared Goff is the one that's throwing the football. Like all of this is going to look different. And so going into the regular season, I'm excited, but at the same time, I'm also just like, yeah, I don't know what this offense is actually going to look like because there are so many new pieces, and it's going to just it's exciting. I can't wait to see Lions, Chiefs, and see how this offense stacks up, especially if Chris Jones continues to sit out. Like we all need to be having our fingers crossed for that. But I mean, going into this season, oddly enough, I would have never said this at the beginning of training camp, but I am more confident in the defense and what the defense can and will do than I am necessarily in what the offense will do. And it's literally, like I said, it's just because I've seen the defense do things where I'm like, oh, this is just going to be better when CJ GJ is the one at playing safety. This is just going to be even better. Like that's a pick if it's Kirby. That coverage is going to be better if it's Cam. Um, the run support is going to be better if it's Aiden. Like it's just certain things that you can just plug and you know pick and choose and be like, oh, this is going to be better with these defensive pieces. And with the offense, it's just like I don't even know if what I'm seeing I'm actually going to see on Sundays because the pieces are so drastically different um, than what the Lions have available to them from an offensive standpoint. Um, Brian Branch might be the best defensive player in this draft. Listen, that has been I think as of right now, he's for the Lions, he's showing it, right? He's absolutely showing it. Karen saying it's so ironic because that was the one thing that was solid last year. It is. It's so ironic that the thing that we absolutely could catch and put our faith in was the offense last year. And this year going into it, it's like I think the offense will be good. And the only reason I can say that is because you still have Jared Goff, you still have Amon-Ra St. Brown, you still have that offensive line, and you still have Ben Johnson. There's some changes that have been made in the running back room is completely different. Your tight end one is now different, and your wide receivers are there, but they're not showing up consistently, through training camp and things like that. And I want to be clear too, like Josh Reynolds has made plays, Marvin's made plays, Khalif has looked great at times. Like when I went to training camp on Thursday, Khalif looks awesome. His ability to get open is fantastic. And I think it's one of those things where if you're worried about like how the offense is going to look without JMO, trust me, it's going to look good because of a guy like Khalif. Um, but it just we haven't seen a lot of the starting offense. And so a lot of what we have to go off of is what we see in camp or what we're hearing coming out of camp. And the thing about camp is that the defense looks good in camp. And so it's like, well, if the defense looks so good, does the defense look good because the offense is bad, or does the defense look good because the defense is good? And I'm choosing at this time to just say the defense looks good because the defense is good. And I'm hoping that to be true once we get into the regular season. Um Ranjiv asking, are we thinking top 10 defense? I'm not gonna say top 10. I've been holding steady that it just has to be top 15. I think this defense will be a top 15 defense. Top 10 is tough. I think put it this way. If Aiden makes the leap, if Aiden goes from, a 9.5 sack guy, a guy who can only get like, I don't want to say only, sorry, a guy that can only get a sack every so often or get like 3 sacks in the game or something like that, and is like a guy that is consistently getting a sack a game. If he starts playing like a Micah Parsons, like a JJ Watt used to, like a TJ Watt, um, and he's like a consistent threat to get home. That's yeah, that then you're gonna start creeping into like top 10 territory because I think having a player that is that disruptive and a secondary that is going to I think is going to take advantage of mistakes that quarterbacks make, then yeah, you start to creep into top 10 categories. The other thing that they're gonna have to do, which is also a huge staple, and it's something that I'm sure Dan Campbell and Aaron Glenn is harping on, they're gonna have to defend the run. If they can shut down the run, they can be stout in run defense. This defense will have a better chance of being top 10. Um, Dan saying, I think they've hidden the O kind of on purpose, like with Ben in Hard Knocks. And I agree. I think they're trying to keep an element of surprise. Um, which again, I don't have a problem with. And that's why I can't say that like I think the defense or I think the offense is bad. I don't think the offense is bad. I do think there's something odd or something there when you're talking about a guy like Josh Reynolds who has played with Jared Goff for years, and he's not finding like consistent success. Again, Jeremy brought it up in the podcast he did today, where he was like, Josh Reynolds hasn't really stood out throughout camp. And is it a huge deal? No, but is it something to take notice of? Yeah, yeah, I notice it, and it's something that I file away to like, huh, Josh Reynolds um isn't consistently making plays or isn't making plays here and there, especially when Amon Ross especially when Amon Ross not practicing. That's when things get even more interesting. Um, Derek saying they might give up some yards, but the pressure and turnover should go way up, and that's what I'm expecting. Right? I do think you're going to have a more aggressive defense. I think you're going to see a more opportunistic defense. Um, I feel like the last few years we've been used to seeing like this bend don't break type of defense, and I think they'll be better than that this year. I think they'll be better than a bend don't break type of defense. Um, Public Enemy saying the doubts that some have in the offense being great again is Jared Goff. If they're top 5 again, when does the doubt in him stop? Like I said, I don't think it's him that I have doubts in. Um, but if they're top 5 again, I mean, I guess it depends, right? Is it top 5 because Jared Goff is thrown like, if Jared Goff is thrown for 4,000 yards, 30 touchdowns, single digit interceptions, I think it goes away then. If it's a top 5 offense because they have, like, the best rushing attack in football and Jared Goff is good, but, like, nothing, like, amazing, I don't think it goes away. I don't think it goes away. So, I think context matters, um, because I don't think this team looks at their offense as, like, Jared has to win it all for them. He's not. They don't look at him the same way the Chiefs look at Patrick Mahomes or the same way the Bengals look at Joe Burrow, where it's, they have to win off the strength of their quarterback play. I really do think this offense is built around the success and production of this offensive line and how well they can get a rushing attack going. And if those two things are going well, then they're able to kind of then that's when they're able to make Jared Goff's job easier. Um, Public Enemy, I'm gonna call Cap. If Jared Goff leads them to a Super Bowl and he is the reason they win that Super Bowl, he's Super Bowl MVP. No one will ever have anything negative to say about Jared Goff ever again. Jared Goff, like I've also said this, that if Jared Goff is the reason they win a Super Bowl, even if he's the reason they win a playoff game, Jared Goff will be able to walk into Brad Holmes' office and sign whatever kind of contract he wants. He's going to have that Joe Flacco type of flex where it's just like whatever I want, you're going to give me. Um, and that's just you know, kind of how it works. Shout out to Jeremy in the chat saying, just make sure Amon Ra is doing his calf raises and everything will be fine. Listen, he needs to do his calf raises. I don't know what you're supposed to do for your hamstrings, but I mean, I have to believe It's a funny thought to have, but I have to believe, like, Amon-Ra's dad is, like, hearing about J-Mo messing up his hamstring again, he's probably just looking at Amon-Ra like, "Oh, why doesn't he go to the gym with you?" Um, I believe someone wrote an article recently. Oh, no, it wasn't an article. Herman Moore had some comments about J-Mo, and actually, they were, like I thought they were actually, like, fair and spot on as far as, like, from one high caliber, like, Hall of Fame wide receiver to a player of JMO's caliber is like some critiques that he thinks that he could just do better. And I don't think they were overly harsh. I thought they were very fair. One of the things he mentioned was that like JMO just needs to trust his hands. He pointed out that like, hey, JMO was a great hands catcher at Alabama. And for some reason or another, he's gotten to the NFL and he feels like he has to catch things with his body. And it just becomes he thinks it's just a mental thing. Like, hey, he needs to get over the mental hurdle of like trying to body catch and he needs to just be better with catching with his hands. But the second thing he said, which kind of goes in line with what Jeremy is saying about Amon-Ra doing his calf raises, he's like, he just thinks that Jamo probably needs to put on some weight. And it's I don't disagree. I don't disagree that Jamo could probably put on a little bit of weight and bulk up a little bit so that he can make those contested catches a little bit better so he can be stronger at the catch point. But on the same token, Devonta Smith for the Eagles has made a pretty good living, a pretty good start to his NFL career by being, a smaller frame and still being dynamic as a wide receiver. So I don't think it's a need, but I think it would potentially help JMO a little bit if he could do it. Um, let's see what else we got in here. I'm gonna answer a few more questions and then I'm gonna get out of here because it's been a long day. Made a video. If you guys haven't been over to the Pride Detroit channel, definitely go check out the training camp observation video I did over there. Um, but let's get a few more of these comments in before I bounce on you guys. Dan saying, I think Josh's arrival with Decker coming back and Amaron coming on all helped our offense. Um, I'd kind of share it. I'd kind of share it equally. Um, and that's the thing. Like I said, I think the offense will be good. I think they have enough pieces. Offensive line is solid. I think I think Josh Reynolds is a guy that Jared Goff knows he can trust in a pinch, especially with some of those deeper routes that they like to run. He runs a really good corner route. Um, and so I think he will be there when Goff needs him most. It's still somewhat shocking to me that like we're not hearing him, I don't want to say turning heads, but it's one of those things where it's like I've heard that Khalif has had good days in camp. I've even heard that Jamos had a good day in camp before he got injured. We've heard about Dylan Drummond. We've heard about obviously we've heard about Amon Ra. We've heard about Sam Laporta. We've heard about Gibbs. Not a whole lot out of Reynolds or Marvin Jones, and so it's a little surprising to in that regard. Um, Perry saying the sun god is a professional. He knows what it takes to be great. Listen, and that comes from having a dad that was a bodybuilder and understood, how much you have to put into your craft and how dedicated you have to be. Um, I don't know if you need to be that dedicated, but I mean, I think again, Amon-Ra has gotten to where he is because of that dedication. And I'm not gonna sit here and tell him that he needs to dial it back when, he's having the success that he wants to have in the NFL. Um, are Gibbs and Laporta Ben Johnson's chain moving specialists or big play threats or both? I'm going to say both. I think they will be both. I think Laporta will probably be a little more on the chain mover side, um, just because in the past of how they've used their tight ends, that's kind of the role they have used them in. They don't typically send their tight ends on a lot of deep routes, I believe. Excuse me. Um, but Gibbs is going to be everything. I think they are going to try to utilize him to do everything they possibly can. Um, and I don't think they're going to try to limit him outside of just again splitting touches with David Montgomery. Um, so yeah. Um, Dan Pascal also saying there was one video with a huge catch, but that's it. And yeah, that's all I kind of remember seeing of Josh Reynolds as well this offseason. Um, But yeah, so again, guys, I appreciate you all kind of coming through, hanging out. I know it's been a minute since I've streamed, but I appreciate everybody coming through, hanging out. Please be sure to hit the like button on your way out. If you haven't hit it already, I would greatly appreciate it. Um, Even though I'm not putting videos up as consistently on this channel, those things, your comments, your likes, all of those things help out this channel so much. For those of you that tuned in over on Twitch, thank you guys. I appreciate you. One day I will get a better laptop and I'll be able to run Streamlabs and we'll be able to have um a better experience for you guys over there. But I do, again, I appreciate you guys so much. Be sure, again, if you're not seeing me over here, you can always catch me over on the Pride of Detroit YouTube channel. I'm always over there making videos. And yeah, appreciate you guys. Hope you have an amazing night. And I will see you guys in the next video. Later.